Terry Lovelace, Staff Sergeant Terry Lovelace. He was on his back, and from the neck down, he was paralyzed. And he was in an excruciating amount of pain. He couldn't stop screaming. There was somebody above him, but whoever it was, it didn't look anything like a human. No, it was all wrong. Its body was tiny, skinny, and it had more than one set of arms. The first set, Terry later described as thick, bulky, and covered in these tiny, sharp hairs. And he said that at the ends, instead of hands, there were two long machete-like appendages. And it was using those appendages, along with other sharp instruments, to cut into Terry's flesh. Terry was wide awake and completely without anesthetic. The pain was absolutely off the charts. The second set of arms, they were just as horrifying as the first. They were damp, and the ends of them were bony, and they hovered right around Terry's head, and they wrapped themselves around his neck, trying to suppress his screams. All Terry could think was that he wanted to wake up, but even while he was thinking that, something inside of him told him that this wasn't a dream, and he couldn't figure out exactly what in the world this was, because he just could not accept what his senses were telling him. What he was experiencing was, of course, impossible. Maybe this was some type of mind control, psychedelic experiment or something. He was in the military. He would later recall that this room was extremely bright and foreign, too clean to be any ordinary hospital room, and way too uniform to be any military room that he had ever seen. Once the drugs wore off, or maybe the drugs that they gave him that were designed to suppress his memories took hold, all he had left was this black void where this event had taken place, and this underlying vague feeling of doom that just wouldn't go away. And it would take years before he would be able to put all of the puzzle pieces together and figure out exactly what had happened. In the meantime, it was just trauma without a narrative, fear that he just couldn't place. And it didn't start with this event either. No, Terry found out later that he had been going through this his entire life. His story is insane. It's about evil entities, government psyops, brain-eating pills, and a nightmare that still continues in his life to this very day. And one of the reasons why Terry's story is so important is because if he's telling the truth, and if this is really happening to him, well, then it could be happening to any one of us, right? Terry told us that he knew something was off from a very young age. One of the very first memories of them coming to get him was when he was just 6 years old. He had been tucked into bed, smothered with love, as always, but sometime during the night, he woke up fully alert. His heart was racing with this unmistakable sensation that he wasn't alone. The house was silent. There were no strange sounds, no creaking floors, yet he knew that something was off. Well, he sat up in his bed and he listened. At first, he thought that he saw movement at the corner of his eye, just this fleeting shadow slipping past the closet door. But when he turned, there was no one there. Then movement again on the opposite side of the room. This too was at his peripheral and it was fleeting. Pretty intense for a 6-year-old. Well, he was just about to pull the covers up over his head when they stepped forward. 4 small figures, each one no more than 2 feet tall. They stood upright, and they balanced easily on 2 feet, with these long tails that trailed behind them. Their eyes glowed yellow in the dim light, and their faces, well, they were frozen in these exaggerated grins, as if they were wearing painted porcelain masks, their smiles painted on. Terry wanted to scream, but instead, somehow, he found the courage to ask a question. What are you? Not who, but what. Well, the question seemed to please them, or at least it didn't aggravate them. One of the figures tilted its head from side to side, as if it were sizing up Terry, studying him. And then Terry heard this voice inside of his head, but it was strange, because it sounded just as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. Come with us, Terry.
Come with us, Terry.
The voice was playful and sweet. The figures extended a small hand, and just like that, Terry's fears vanished. And in the place of his fears, oddly, calmness curiosity, a sense of recognition that made no logical sense at all. He felt as if they were familiar, as if he had known them for a while. Well, they asked again, "Come with us, Terry?"
Come with us, Terry.
They promised to take him someplace fun. They spoke softly, sweetly, patiently. Their painted smiles never moved, but their eyes, they did. They watched him closely, as if they were gauging his response. And somewhere in the back of Terry's mind, memories suddenly flickered on. A room, a round or oval room, a soft gray floor, other children dressed in nightclothes, just like Terry, none of them familiar. And presiding over the whole thing, a woman, a human woman.
Welcome to Vel Arcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
6-year-old Terry was standing in his room, and he was remembering some type of a play place. He had been taken there by short familiar entities that he would later call the Monkey Men. And the person in charge, she was a human woman, and her name was Sue. But she wasn't quite human. No, that's because she communicated the same way that these monkey men did, directly, thought to thought. She would praise the children whenever they completed a task with colorful blocks or tiles, and she would comfort them whenever they became sad or frightened. And there was another figure in this room as well, a little girl named Jenny. Jenny never played. No, and she wore this old-fashioned dress, these white socks and black shoes. Her hair was always in pigtails. Terry remembered most of the details about her, but he had a very difficult time recalling her face. Her eyes, however, well, they were unforgettable. Solid white, no pupils, as if she were blind, and she never blinked, and she never spoke. She simply stood, and I guess watched. Jenny was scary. And on that night in his bedroom, when he was 6 years old and standing face to face with these monkey men, those memories resurfaced, and they did so just enough to tug at him, just enough to remind him that it was all okay. We're friends. Still, something stopped him. A sudden clarity, a spike of fear that cut through the calmness like ice water. "No," Terry said, "I'm not going. Not again." Well, the change was immediate. The painted smiles morphed for the first time. They twisted into something sinister. Their glowing eyes deepened, and their pupils widened until each eye was nearly all black. Terry sensed irritation, annoyance, as though a routine interaction had gone off script. And that is when Terry screamed. As these entities moved closer, Terry screamed at the very top of his lungs, and a moment later, his parents were in the room and these monkey men were gone. This actually became a pattern for Terry, night after night, sporadically, unpredictably, always ending the same way, the monkey men vanishing just before help arrived, always leaving Terry shaken, exhausted, and increasingly afraid to sleep. His parents, of course, believed that he was just having nightmares. Well, Terry began sleeping with the door open and the nightlight on, and then eventually with his bedroom light on, or at least he tried. His parents drew the line with that. And as he got older, he began to understand something that most children never have to consider. And that is that adults don't always believe you when you're telling the truth. And over time, this angered him. And he finally decided that if his parents weren't going to protect him, well, then he would have to protect himself. If the monkey men could come and go at will, and if they could stand at the foot of his bed and then vanish just before the lights came on, well, then the only solution, however unthinkable, was that Terry would have to meet them on Terry's terms. Well, Terry knew where his father kept his gun, was a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, and it was hidden just behind the headboard of his parents' bed. Well, he knew where the ammunition was as well, so he shared this plan with his best friend Ernie, who believed him about the Monkey Men, and that alone made all the difference. Together, the two boys mapped out a strategy. It was simple. Practice first, then kill. If the Monkey Men were to come again, well, Terry would be ready. So early one Saturday morning, before cartoons, before his parents were awake, the boys met at a nearby park about a block away from Terry's house. The revolver was loaded. Ernie brought these two hand-drawn targets, these crude figures of the Monkey Men. Well, he set them up against the large tree. Then he walked back, and he stood next to Terry, who was fiddling with the gun. Ernie had insisted that Terry needed to disengage the safety. Neither one of them knew that this particular gun had no safety. Well, as Terry was looking for this safety, Ernie got impatient, and he reached for the gun. And for just a moment, there was this tug-of-war, and then there was this flash of light and this thunderous boom. Well, with ringing in their ears, the boys just looked at each other for a second. And then panic set in. The bullet had to have gone somewhere, right? Well, they quickly checked their bodies for blood, but didn't find any. And a second later, terrified, they were on their bicycles racing home, absolutely sure that the entire neighborhood had just heard them fire that gun. And just then, a police cruiser pulled up, and they knew that they were going to jail for sure. Well, just as Terry was about to say that it was an accident and he was oh so sorry, the officer asked if either one of them had heard a gunshot. Well, that must have meant that the officer didn't know that they had pulled that trigger, right? So Terry, thinking fast, said that he thought that it was a firecracker. The officer accepted that answer and then drove on. He never even noticed the unmistakable outline of a handgun pressing against the fabric of Terry's shorts. Never noticed the edge of the handle peeking out from the pocket of an 8-year-old boy who was clearly sitting rigid with terror. Well, after that, the boys rode home in silence, and the revolver was returned to its hiding place. The plan to use a gun to stop these Monkey Men ended that morning, but the fear, of course, did not. So Terry decided that he would use a bayonet. See, Ernie's father had one tucked away, and Ernie got a hold of it, and he gave it to Terry. Terry hid it beneath his mattress. Then, when he went to sleep, he would put it underneath his pillow for easy reach. The plan was simple. Wait until the first one spoke, and then bloodshed. But the one night that he forgot to move the blade within reach, well, that was the one night that they returned. Somehow they knew. They knew when he was armed, and they knew when he wasn't. And after that, they only came when he was defenseless. Well, from that night on, Terry realized that he had absolutely no way to protect himself from these Monkey Men, and his terror wouldn't end. Ever. Terry James Lovelace was born on May 22, 1955, in St. Louis, Missouri, and he had had memories of being visited by entities that he called the Monkey Men for as far back as he could remember. Well, as he got older, these Monkey Men transformed into something else, and strangely, so did his fear. Somehow, over time, it transformed into something like apathy. Whenever these beings would come, for some reason his mind would just go numb, and he wouldn't care about anything. It first happened when he was 11 years old. One night he went to bed, and then he quickly drifted off to sleep.
I opened my eyes and found I was already sitting upright in my bed. It was in the middle of the night, and there were these brilliant multicolored lights shining through the curtains. I could tell that they weren't automotive headlights, and they weren't emergency lights from a fire truck or a police car either. Oddly, I almost felt disinterested. There was an odd noise too, a pulsating hum. It wasn't as much loud as it was powerful. I could feel it in my chest like a bass guitar note on a giant amplifier.
Terry sat in his bed, just feeling that hum and watching that light for a while, And then he felt a strange compulsion to go to the window.
Despite my disinterest, I felt compelled to look out the window. I don't know what I expected to see, but I wasn't afraid. I got off the bed and walked to the window, pulled back the drapes, and peeked through the blinds.
Just outside of his second-floor window was a floating silver disc.
It was shrouded in a heavy fog that was coming from beneath it. It was hovering over the front lawn just a few feet outside of my window.
One would think that Terry would have some sort of emotion about this, but really he was nearly apathetic. He looked at it for a few moments, and then he turned around, went back to his bed, and then went back to sleep.
The morning was a weird experience too. It was as if I had just laid down, blinked, and it was dawn. I had no dreams. As soon as my eyes opened, it was morning and I was fully awake and alert.
Wow. From that point on, and for the rest of his life, Terry would have these strange experiences. But oddly, his memory of them would begin to fade until finally he was just left with this overwhelming feeling that something in his life just wasn't right. An impending doom that he just couldn't place. Well, he got older, and then he joined the Navy. And that's when he met a man named Toby. And the first week in June 1977, these two men planned a weekend getaway to Devil's Den State Park. They wanted to get as deep into the woods as they could. So on Friday, they made the long drive out, and they ended up in a restricted area of a wildlife preserve. Well, they set up camp, and then they went to sleep. The next morning, Saturday, June 11, 1977, just about an hour before sunup, Terry woke up in his tent to what he thought were the lights on top of a park ranger's truck. While he shifted on his air mattress to look past Toby, who was already peering out of the tent toward the lights. If this were indeed a park ranger, well, these guys were about to be in a boatload of trouble, right? Military men in a restricted area of the park? Yeah. Well, Terry was groggy when he looked out, and he thought that he saw about a dozen or so children meandering out there in the clearing. Well, that didn't make any sense at all. These guys were pretty far into the sticks, at least an hour or more off of the main road. So he asked Toby, "What are all those kids doing out there?" Well, Toby turned to him with this terrified expression, and then he soberly whispered, "Look at them again, Terry. They're not human. Don't you remember what just happened?" And then instantly, Terry was wide awake, and he indeed remembered what had just happened just moments earlier. Sometime after Terry and Toby had went to sleep, they had been awakened by this powerful hum, and then the tent was filled with this brilliantly powerful white light. And as Terry was squinting from the brightness, he felt his stomach drop, as if he had just suddenly fallen. The next thing that he knew, he and Toby were standing in a strange but oddly familiar place, with light coming from every direction.
It was huge. Everything was white or stainless steel. This made everything very bright inside. The walls and even the ceiling reflected light. There were what looked to be flying saucers. They were aligned in a neat row at the far side. We could see walkways in different levels with unrecognizable symbols etched into the walls. We were not the only humans. There were at least 50 other people with us.
The place looked perfectly clean, and everything had these smooth edges. Well, they found themselves in some sort of a line with other humans. At the end of the line, groups of 4 and 5 were being taken away, and the line was slowly getting shorter. The experience was terrifying, and Terry told us that first thing he wanted to do was run, but he found himself unable to move except for the flow of this line. He just stood there, and when the line shortened, he found himself moving right along with the rest of the crowd. He said that he had this overwhelming sensation that he was just part of the herd, one of the cattle, that he was just one of the other animals. The only problem, of course, was that the other animals were fellow humans, and he himself wasn't an animal. Terry said that the place was huge, and there were hundreds of those little gray aliens. They were all busy, moving around like drones. He also said that there were what looked like United States military personnel there as well, and they were apparently working right alongside of these aliens. which I thought was horrifying. Then Terry saw an alien of a completely different race. This one didn't act like a drone at all, and it stood about 6 feet tall. It was pinkish in color, and when Terry made eye contact with it, he immediately felt mentally and emotionally overpowered. This being was instantly inside of Terry's head, and not just knowing Terry's thoughts and his feelings. No, somehow this being knew Terry at his core.
I'm in your memories, Terry.
Seeing through Terry, knowing his entire life inside and out, his friends, his family, his deepest fears. Terry said that he looked away as quickly as he could, but from that point on, he had a very difficult time shaking that feeling. Before he got to know much more, the line had shortened, and they took him and the men around him down this long hall. One side of the hall was lined with dozens of large, what looked like to be aquariums. They were filled with this strange pink liquid. Something not quite human, not quite animal, not quite alien, was being grown, I guess. And each one, these strange pieces of flesh, were mostly motionless, but every once in a while, one would move, giving Terry the creepiest feeling.
I thought they were puppies at first, but they weren't. Then I thought they were some type of reptilian lizard-like things. They were ugly with big eyes. Halfway down the hall, one of the eyes twitched, and then I could tell you what they were. They were some type of deformed human beings.
Well, finally, Terry made it to the end of the hall, and that's when he was put onto that examination table. Once Terry was put on top of that examination table, he said that he remembered that this had happened before, over and over for his entire life. He said that he knew that things were about to get extremely painful, and he started screaming at the very top of his lungs. Well, right then, two tall, I know, this is absolutely crazy. Terry said, right then, two tall insect-like creatures, something resembling large animal-sized praying mantises, approached the table. Terry actually got all choked up and real quiet as he shared this part with Amy and I over the phone. And if he were just making this up, well, whatever happened to him at this point, it affected him greatly. He said that they stripped him down and then they started to operate on him. They didn't put him to sleep. Then they just cut into his flesh with these strange instruments. He said that he could feel every single incision, and it was excruciating. He said that it was so bad that he never stopped screaming until finally one of these praying mantises things leaned over, got right up in his face, and then with a long bony insect-like appendage, poked Terry in the forehead and said, "Go to sleep." Well, the next thing that Terry knew, he was lying on the ground next to Toby outside of the tent, still paralyzed. And at first, he thought that they had made a mistake and they had put them back in the wrong place. But just as he was pondering that thought, a few of those drone-like gray aliens dragged him and Toby back to the tent. Well, that's all that Terry remembered until he woke up, foggy-headed, thinking that there were children out there in the clearing. Well, now, inside the tent, Terry and Toby looked out and they saw this huge craft hovering just above the treetops.
We could see two sides clearly. There were randomly dispersed square panels of light on each side. It reminded me of a 5-story office building at night, with windows lit here and there on every floor. Along the very top was a row of larger windows that slanted outward. They were all lit. I saw faint shadows of movement behind these larger panels.
Then, moments later, it shot down this brilliant light into the forest.
All these beings walked into the light. They just dissolved, disappearing, 2 or 3 at a time.
Then this craft lifted higher and higher until it disappeared into the night sky. Terry told us that shortly after this memory too faded. But this marked the beginning of the floodgates for Terry, because somehow the OSI found out about this. And they started questioning Terry. And then, using whatever mind control techniques that they had, they were able to unlock Terry's memories. Well, not all of them, but enough. Then, strangely, after they had gotten a ton of information, I guess all that they wanted, they tried to suppress Terry's memories again. They gave him these pills. These pills clouded his memory, and they also gave him these horrible headaches. Well, they demanded that he take these pills, or he could go the other way. He could be eliminated. Brain-eating pills is what I call them. At first, Terry was compliant, but eventually he stopped taking the pills. And then finally, after decades, he decided that he was going to come forward with his story and the powers that be damned. He wrote 2 books, Incident at Devil's Den and Devil's Den: The Reckoning. And then he was gracious enough to give Amy and I several hours of his time. Most of the interview that we did with Terry was over the phone. We did do some video, but much of that had a terrible lag, and a lot of it got corrupted. But some of that video was good enough to share.
In 2017, as I was preparing to publish my book on Amazon, I was visited by a non-human entity that I refer to as Betty. And Betty spoke with me telepathically in my home. I asked her why she was in my living room. She said she wanted to tell me that my government would not be pleased if I published my book and tell all the details that I told.
This video with Terry comes from our archives. It was taken a couple of years back when we were super green, and as you can see, the quality is horrible, and that was some of the best footage we got while we were doing the interview. We are just a small YouTube channel. It's only Amy and myself right now. But I promise you, as soon as we get a big enough following, we're going to hire a team. And when we do, I'm going to get the best tech guy in the business. And then after that, my goal, of course, is to deliver perfect audio and perfect video quality. Terry told us that this entity, Betty, was the exact same entity that he had known as Sue when he was a child. Well, Terry's nightmare is still going on. He told us that he still has those same feelings of impending doom, and he's not sure if that's because they're still taking him or if because what he went through was so traumatic that his brain just can't reconcile it. You know, in these types of abduction stories, the go-to for skeptics is, of course, sleep paralysis. That's when the mind is just half awake. Your body is still trapped in that sleep mode. So your brain starts to fabricate a new reality. It's kind of like dreaming, but while you're awake. They also point to childhood trauma, false memories, even suggestibility of some type. And you guys know me, right? I can't just dismiss those possible explanations. But they do seem to leave unanswered questions, at least for me. See, Terry came across extremely genuine, and in both of his books and in our interview, he stayed very consistent across the decades of his life. And of course, then there's all those other people, right? I think it's numbering in the millions now, who have had these exact same experiences, or at least they claim that they have. It definitely leaves one wondering, right? You know, what I find most unsettling about these stories is that many of them involve beings that seem to be sociopathic, or at least indifferent or suffering, apparent in the fact that they were operating on Terry while he was awake and without giving him any type of anesthetic. In the end, I guess, if Terry's experiences are delusions, well, then the human brain, as we've been told so many times, is capable of producing horrors that are so elaborate, so internally consistent, that they can fracture the human mind. And if they're not delusions, well, then we, of course, are left with a far more troubling proposition, and that is, many of us, it might be you, or it might be me, are being taken and experimented on, and we just don't remember the screaming that we did last time because, well, we never do.
First, I want to thank Terry for sharing his experience with us, for helping us to understand his more difficult memories and allowing us to share them with you. Personally, I found Terry to be very sincere, and we are truly grateful for his time and trust. You know, Damon and I are just a couple of Gen Zers who grew up before the internet, trying to make sense of these mysteries in an age of endless information. Memberships and donations on Buy Me a Coffee really do help keep the lights on while we research, write, film, and edit these mysteries. You'll find a link in the description. And if you're in the mood to keep the mystery alive, check out one of the videos on your screen.